conectado desde la sala de videoconferencia de la Facultad de Económicas de la UNED con Daniele Ganser, historiador suizo y profesor de la Universidad de Basilea y autor del libro Los ejércitos secretos de la OTAN, la Operación Gladio y el terrorismo en Europa Occidental. Y por eso le entrevistamos hoy aquí, para saber qué fue la Operación Gladio y cómo se desarrolló en nuestro país, ya que el libro contiene un capítulo dedicado al mismo. I'm going to ask you a group of questions. The first are going to be about Gladio in general, and the history and so on. And then I want to talk about Gladio in Spain, about your chapter of Gladio in Spain. So maybe we can talk first about the general things about Gladio in Europe. And so what is Gladio? What's the definition of Gladio? And what are the secret armies of the NATO?
So the word Gladio is actually used as a name for the Italian secret army, which operated in Italy during the Cold War. Gladio was discovered in 1990, first time in Italy, and then Italian members of the secret army said that similar secret armies existed in all countries of Western Europe. The Italian Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, at the time explained that the name Gladio was secret for a long time. Nobody knew about it. And it was the name for a stay-behind army, which meant it was a network of soldiers who waited for a Soviet invasion. That was one of the main ideas. And the other thing was that they tried to manipulate the Italian political system in the absence of a Soviet invasion.
I would like to know if it was financed by the CIA and coordinated by NATO. Where did the money came from?
Well, the idea for the network was an American and a British idea. Washington and London at the beginning of the Cold War were scared that in Western Europe communist parties or at sometimes socialist parties would come to power. And in Italy we had very strong communist parties, and in France we also had strong communist parties. And so they set up these networks, and so the money in the beginning came from the CIA, the American Central Intelligence Agency, which is the foreign secret service of the US, and much of the training came from the British, the MI6, the British Foreign Secret Service. So really it was the CIA and the MI6 together working in Italy and instructing the secret soldiers of the Gladio units. The coordination of the stay-behind armies was managed through NATO. So we had a secret branch within NATO, which was called the Allied Clandestine Committee, ACC. And in this ACC, the representatives of the Gladio in Italy, people from the CIA, people from the MI6, but also from all the other NATO countries, thus from Norway or Denmark or France or Germany, they met and sat together to discuss what to do with the secret armies.
So how did the secret soldiers receive orders? There were hierarchical direct orders, or there was freedom of action?
There was a hierarchical structure because in Italy, for instance, you have the defense ministry, and within the defense ministry you have the military secret service. And within the military secret service, there was a sub-branch, which is that Gladio branch. So it was really integrated as a secret element within the military secret service. It was not part of the army. It was part of the military secret service, but in the sense that people who were working in these networks, they were private people. They didn't consider themselves to be working for the state. Some, and that is the delicate thing, were from the extreme right-wing groups like Avanguardia Nazionale or Ordine Nuovo. These people in Italy were fascists convinced that they had to fight communism because they thought the communists are atheists, and they hated the atheists very much. They were devout Catholics, and they didn't want that the communists come into power. So these people were supported by the United States and by Great Britain in order to keep that delicate balance of power in Italy and in other countries in such a way that the left would not gain too much influence.
So you mean that there were two different kind of gladius soldiers, like two groups of gladius soldiers, like the ones that were prepared to act in a possible USSR invasion, and others that were terrorists, fascists.
That is the delicate thing, you know. That is really the most complicated question to answer. It is true. All of these secret soldiers say, we just waited for the Soviet invasion. That is not a criminal thing to do. I mean, these people just thought, in case Italy or France or Germany or Switzerland or Greece, in case any of these countries is going to be occupied, okay, then we come into action. We don't do anything if there's no invasion. So that is a first group, that is correct. But then there's another group, and that is also correct, which was more interested to fight the political fight in the country. There is a general, an Italian general, who commanded the Gladio network in the 1970s, and his name is Gerardo Serravalle. And he explains in a book that when the CIA came to the training center, they had a training center on an island off the Italian coast. And the gladiators were trained there. And then when the CIA came, the General Serravalle explained to the CIA, you know, we have arms caches in hidden places, so in case of the Soviet invasion, we're ready and everything. And then he explains that the CIA was not so interested in their preparations for a Soviet invasion. They were much more interested, he says, in what they can do to influence the Italian political system. So in case there were large protest movements, what they could break a protest movement, or what they could carry out destabilization operations. And that is a very delicate thing with the NATO secret armies, because we now know that some members of the Italian right wing, they came forward and they said, yes, this secret network existed, and yes, I knew of it, and I cooperated with it. And I carried out terrorist attacks, which were then blamed on the communists or on the other groups on the left, and this helped to destabilize Italy. Vincenzo Vinciguerra is there the most important source. He then went to jail, but in jail he explained, you know, NATO covered us. We could carry out terrorist attacks in Italy. And then we were flown, some of us, to Spain during the Franco dictatorship. That was a safe haven. And then we were flown to another country. So it's a very delicate thing.
For example, after I will ask you about the Italian fascist terrorists that came to Spain. But for example, Ali Akka, the person that tried to kill John Paul II. I think you, in your book, in your chapter about Turkey, you talk also about his organization. Was he? Can we say that he was also an stay-behind soldier?
In Turkey, we have also a group of people who belong to the Grey Wolves, which was a very nationalist and sometimes militant part of Turkish establishment. And these people, some of them worked in the stay-behind networks. But it is very difficult to say, this person we know for sure was a member of the Turkish secret army, and this person is just a freelance terrorist. I mean, that is very difficult to say, because we don't have the lists of all the people who worked in the secret armies. The military secret services only confirmed, yes, we had secret armies, yes, they were equipped with explosives, yes, they were equipped with weapons, yes, they were trained by the CIA, yes, they were trained by MI6, yes, they were linked to NATO, and NATO was in command. But whenever we try, as historians, to talk to NATO and tell them we need documents, were these people involved in terrorism? When we try to talk to the CIA and say we need more documents, were you linked to acts of terrorism in Europe? I mean, then the CIA said we're not going to comment, and NATO says the same thing, we're not going to comment, because it is still today unspeakable almost to say that there was CIA-linked terrorism in Europe. So it is ongoing research. We know that acts of terrorism were carried out, and we know that many people, including in Turkey and in Italy, who were involved in these acts of terrorism, say the Americans and the British covered us. They wanted us to carry out these acts of terrorism, but it's very difficult to prove.
I'm very interested in the economic part of Gladio. I know there is not much information, but for example, in Italy, does it the Gladio network had something to do with the Vatican Bank, the IOR, and the Ambrosiano, and so on, and the money of the mafia?
This I don't know for sure. It is unclear how the money flows were organized. What we do know is that in one case, the Italian secret soldiers, the gladiators in Italy, they said, well, you know, the Americans, they give us the weapons for free. And the British, if we buy the weapons from the British, then we have to pay. And then there was a debate within the defense ministry in Italy whether they should take the weapons from the Americans, from the CIA, or from the British, from the MI6. And then the military professionals said, well, it's actually better to work together with the British because they have a better training. And what they did in the end is that they went to the British, took the training from the British, and at the same time took the weapons from the CIA for free. And in fact, when the British found out, they were very angry because, you know, they wanted to sell their weapons as well. Now, the whole structure of financial flows into Italy during the Cold War is very complicated. Banco Ambrosiano, many other structures, they had black money flowing through their accounts. And whether some of this black money was used to support the secret armies is possible, but we don't know.
Have you studied the links between some Gladio soldiers or people like Licio Gelli or Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi, with the Order of Malta? Is there? Have you studied that, or is there any more links?
What I looked at is like people like Licio Gelli. I looked at these people in more detail. Licio Gelli was obviously a right-wing extremist in the Italian Cold War, and he was convinced that the Cold War was a war. You know, he didn't consider it to be peacetime. He thought we are at war with the Italian communists. And so he was actually paid a lot of money by the United States to make sure that the influence of the Italian right-wing groups were strong in Italy. And Gelli made this statement that, you know, thanks to Gladio, Italy didn't become a zone of communist influence. So he was proud, and he said, we had a lot of influence behind the scenes. Obviously, in public, people would say Italy is a sovereign country and is a democratic country. But he says that was not true. We were neither democratic nor sovereign because we had a parallel structure, in this case, the Propaganda Due, which was a network of people who were from the parliament, who were from the executive, who were leading industrialists, who were bankers, and who also were judges or police officers or military officers. And they all cooperated behind the scenes. And that is not the idea of democratic checks and balances. In a democracy, you actually have the parliament which controls the executive. Okay? And if something goes wrong, you have the judge who says, you know, it's not all right. But in Italy, with the Propaganda Due and with Gladio, we had parallel structures who operated behind the lines. And Licio Gelli was always invited to the United States when a new president came into office, such when in 1981 Ronald Reagan became the new president of the United States. Licio Gelli was there. He was invited because he was an important person from the globe. And the same in Germany. If you look at Reinhard Gehlen, whom you mentioned, he was a general who worked for Hitler during the Second World War. And many people think that at the end of the Second World War, all the generals who worked for Hitler went to the Nuremberg trials. You know, they went directly to jail. And that's not true. Some did, but others were flown to Washington because they were useful. Okay, the Counterintelligence Corps, which is an American secret service, they recruited some of the Nazis and said, now, why don't you run secret operations for us in Germany? You are useful. And Reinhard Gehlen, he was the chief of Fremde Heere Ost. He was then the first commander of the first German secret service, which was called Organisation Gehlen. And that's quite embarrassing, you know, that actually a general from Hitler was the first commander of the first German secret service. But under these circumstances, the stay-behind armies and these secret structures could be set up also in Germany. When I say Germany, I mean obviously the part controlled by Washington and not the part controlled by Moscow.
And do you think they really feared a USSR invasion, or what did they fear the most? The Soviet dictatorship, or that their multinational companies could not have access to cheap labor salaries, for example? I mean, because maybe it was, I think it was an excuse, the USSR invasion, because as you said, they didn't want the communist parties to be in power. But also, not just the communist parties, but also the working class movement, I think. Because why did they fear so much the USSR? And by the other way, they were going to China. Nixon was going to China, and China was also a communist dictatorship. So I don't understand that very well.
Well, this is a question which comes up many times for historians. If you look at the Cold War, you can ask, why was the CIA fighting the communists? Why was the MI6 fighting the communists? So what was the problem? And obviously one side of the problem was that people hate the communists. They thought they have totalitarian structures. There was no voting right, for instance, in Romania and Bulgaria. You know, there was just the Communist Party. You could not vote. You could not, you know, meet where you wanted. You had secret services coming and arrest you. Under Stalin, for instance, the Soviet Union was a totalitarian system. So some people in the CIA and some people in MI6, they were especially worried about these things. And that's why they said, we fought for freedom, in the sense of we fought for a good thing. We tried to liberate people from communist oppression. Now that is one story, and it's true. But there is another story, which is also true. In some countries, we had democratically elected presidents, like in Chile, for instance. We had Salvador Allende. He was democratically elected, and he tried, you know, to give more money to the people in Chile and to become more independent of the United States. Now, he was overthrown in 1973 by the CIA, and Pinochet was installed, who was a brutal dictator. So people go like, we thought you fight against dictators. We thought you fight against, you know, the oppression of people. But in this case, you actually installed the dictator. Why did you do that? I mean, it doesn't make sense if it really is true that you fight for freedom. And then you see that the CIA, in some cases, is not interested in fighting for freedom at all, but is interested in securing actually economic privileges. That's what you say, you know, you say, what is it if we think about the money? What is it? Is it actually the money? Why they do all these things, you know, that big companies have bigger profits? And there is obviously a lot of examples. In Guatemala, for instance, you had United Fruit Company, if you want a concrete example of a company. And United Fruit Company, today called Chiquita, they produced bananas and other fruit in Guatemala. And they produced this very cheaply. And the farmers, they were exploited. They belonged to big haciendas, and they had no rights, okay? They had no salary, or just very, very small salary. And then a new government came in, Jacobo Arbenz. And he said, now let's change this economic structure. It is not fair and it is not right. We should give every farmer a bit of land so he can have a little income. You know, just a very little income. He could not get rich. It would just be a little bit for him and his family. But that obviously meant that the big companies would lose their big land, and that was not acceptable. So the CIA came in and they overthrew the government of Guatemala in 1954. Obviously, that was against democracy, but it was for international companies. And now the question comes: how about Europe? Was that the same? It is obviously something which applied also to Europe. Americans and the British were scared that the labor movement would be very strong. and that labor unions, as you had them in France and as you had them in Italy and also in Belgium, would actually dominate the whole economic discourse. In the end, Europe was much more lucky than Latin America because most countries managed to have good salaries for their people, to have social welfare plans. I mean, all these things that we have today in Europe, people fought for them. Voting rights for women, freedom of press, this obviously with limitations. But so it is true what you say, this fight for money is always part of the picture.
Yes, because maybe that's the only information that I would like to have more. Maybe in your next book about Gladio, you can study this, because it can seem strange that the U.S. government was fighting against the Nazis in the Second World War, but after they were hiring some of them, like Klaus Barbie and Scorzeni or Reinhard Gehlen, and they were protecting them and hiring them for their own interests. So this makes me think that we should not think so much in terms of nations, but of oligarchic power of some multinational companies, because as I said before, there's no problem with China right now, and it's a dictatorship. So the problem is not the dictatorship, but the problem is that the thing is that if you can invest or not in that country. If it's a dictatorship, but it lets you have your companies there, and you can have your companies in that country, there's no problem. But if it's a dictatorship that doesn't want those companies to be there, then there is a problem, and then they have to change the government. I don't know if I'm wrong. But
this is obviously something which many people are interested in. It's the debate about the free market. Basically, what people say is the free market means everybody can invest everywhere in the world, and the best products will be then generated, and everybody everywhere in the world will get richer and will have a better life. That is the theory, okay? But obviously we see that in reality it very often is the case that some countries are poor and they have a lot of debts, and they just have to pay interest on their debts all the time. Their people don't have any education, they can't go to school, they can't even read, and they have no chance to get, build a strong middle class. And you just have a very, very small oligarchy, as you called it, and that is the correct term. It just means that you have an upper class of millionaires. For instance, in Angola, if you want. Angola is an interesting country. They have a lot of oil. It's all offshore. But Angola has a millionaire class. These people are very, very rich. They rule the country. They used to be communists, but it doesn't matter. They now became very rich. And the rest of the country is very poor. And what you say is correct, that as long as it's possible to invest in these countries, the government can stay in place. But to take a new example, if you take the Iraq war, which started in 2003, I mean, Saddam Hussein obviously was a dictator, and he was a brutal dictator. He tortured his people, he used weapons of mass destruction. He really used them against his people. Later he didn't have them anymore, but he was an evil dictator. Only he was supported. He was supported by Washington. He was supported by European governments during the 1980s. Now, in the 90s, they changed their mind. And in 2003, they overthrew him and said, we are now for democracy. Democracy is important. And that is always the story we hear. We always get the story, we only do this for democracy. We don't do it for profit. We do it for democracy. And here in Europe, we just love to believe that because it sounds good and it sounds ethical and it sounds correct. But if you look at the details, you see that now in Iraq, the oil is being, opened up to foreign investments. Like ExxonMobil can invest, Chevron can invest, Statoil can invest, BP can invest, Shell can invest. Also Chinese and Malaysian companies, Petronas, they can invest, and they're actually buying part of that oil. They couldn't do that when Saddam Hussein was still in power. So it is true what you say. We always have to look at the money flow. We have to look, what is the interest of NATO in Europe. And during the Cold War, the interest was, in many ways, also to protect the investments. That is true.
Now I'm going to ask you some questions about Spain, about your chapter of Spain. Maybe we can begin in the Civil War, or if you want to make a brief introduction of Gladio in Spain, I don't know. But maybe I would like to ask you, what's the background for Gladio in Spain after the Civil War?
I mean, the case of Spain was very special, because Spain was a dictatorship under Franco. And in a dictatorship, you don't need to manipulate the elections, or you don't need to, fight the communists. I mean, Franco was making sure that there were no communists in the Italian, in the Spanish government. So that was a completely different situation compared to France or Germany or Italy. The question is, what was then the function of Spain? Were there secret armies in Spain as well during the Franco dictatorship? And there we actually have the same problem. We see, yes, there were secret armies, but then Franco and his system, he had so many different units that he could use for illegal operations. He didn't actually need a secret army. So the interesting thing is actually coming in the 1970s when Franco dies and Spain enters NATO in 1982. That's when you really look at Spain in this transition from a dictatorship to a democracy. And there it is interesting to see, how does that very young democracy look at that very difficult chapter of the secret armies? And there we just found out that the military secret service, I think it's called CESIT, I'm not sure whether I pronounce it correctly, but the military secret service of Spain, during its time as a democracy, continues to run these secret armies. And when in 1990 the secret armies are being discovered in Italy, Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, Prime Minister of Italy, says, these secret armies existed also in Spain and in France and in Germany and in Belgium. And the governments in these other countries, they were very, very embarrassed because they didn't want to talk about it. And some people in the Spanish parliament, now that is very good, when you have a democracy, you have people in parliament who ask questions. You didn't have that during the Franco years. But then, in 1990, you have people in the Spanish parliament who ask questions and say, we need more information about these secret armies. The problem was only that Defense Minister Serra at the time in Spain said, no, we're not going to talk about this, and we don't know much about it anyway, and all in all, it was not very strong performance. I mean, the democracy was probably too weak. There's no knowledge about the Spanish secret army in the Spanish parliament.
I was very surprised to read in your book that there was a Gladio base in the Canary Islands, in Maspalomas. What said Alberto Bolo, a secret soldier, about the Las Palmas base?
The Las Palmas base is in that way similar to other bases in Italy, that it was an island. When you have the mainland and you have the islands, it is very easy to have something hidden or secret on an island. I mean, it is the same thing in Italy. They had the Centro Addestramento Guastatori, which was CAG, which was the center of the gladiators in Italy. It was on an island. And in Italy and in other countries, the idea was that these islands could also be used to put political prisoners there. So, they served as a twofold thing, as a training camp for the secret armies. But in case of emergency, we have some sources who say these islands would have been used as prisons.
And what about Scorzeni, the Nazi? He lived in Spain until he died. Was he related to Gladio structures?
It is very hard to say what his exactly role, the role of Scorzeni, but we have different right-wing extremists who just move in these networks. I mean, that was one of the questions that, as a historian, I was very surprised to find that we have so many right-wing extremists in the secret armies of NATO. As you correctly said, at the end of the Second World War, the idea was we have defeated fascism, we have defeated right-wing extremism, And we don't want right-wing extremists in secret armies. Why would we give them explosives and arms and training and fly them around with the help of the Secret Service? You know, that is something which is completely unthinkable. In some countries, like Norway, we had people who were just people from the center. They were not extremists in any way. I mean, I talked to different secret soldiers in Norway, and they were mainly preoccupied that Norway had been occupied so quickly during the Second World War by the Germans, and they said, we need a second option. We need a secret army. Not much understanding for that, you know, that some people said, we want a guerrilla, a secret army, but we don't do any terrorism and we are not right-wing